A pasta was a corridor that connected a house's courtyard to its residential section. Archaeological evidence from the city of Olynthos reveals that pastas were added to Greek home design in the 5th century BCE. Greeks had no qualms about combining their work and their private lives, and many of them worked from home. Artisans like blacksmiths, sculptors and potters often had workshops in their houses. Similarly, women also worked in the house, and were, if the household was wealthy enough, they could. The inner courtyard was the nexus of the house. Functionally, it allowed air to circulate, and it also sometimes housed in the center of the courtyard was women would often use the space. Furthermore, the bathroom was located in the back of the house. Much like today, it was used for cleaning and washing, although the Greeks used chamber pots instead of toilets. Most bathrooms had a luterion, mirrors, Greek homes had kitchens, where the Greeks did not often. They also occasionally ate poultry, fish, and other food was cooked on a tripod. Other cooking implements the family also used. Symposia were major social institutions. The party took place in the men. Food was served on low. During a symposium, musicians, however, wives and the Pyrgos, or upper stories, was the women's quarter of the house, where they could. The rooftops were also at the beginning of spring, with these pots.
I hope you now have a better... What would you like to do? As you wish.
My friend, I'd offer you a drink. As you can probably tell by all the great wine was in addition. I promise I'll meet you.
Winemaking dates back to the 4th or 3rd millennium. It became widespread in Greece during the Bronze Age. The first step in the process was always harvesting. According to Homer, harvesting was often accompanied by ancient Greek wine. Mainly came in 3 different varieties: Osteros, Glucothion. It could be flavored with spices. It was also much stronger than. Because of this,
Welcome to Laconia. Sparta had a unique hierarchy, especially compared to the rest of... Everyone had their... I will find you again.
Spartan society was structured around austerity, self-sufficiency, and a hostility towards foreign elements. It was divided into three social classes: citizens, perioikoi, and helots. Citizens were called Spartans, or homoioi. They were free men and women with mostly equal rights and wealth, though their contributions to political life were extremely limited. The perioikoi lived in surrounding areas under Spartan control. They were also part of helots. They were people who had lost their... Helots were considered property instead of people. As a result, they had... Helots made up the majority of Sparta's population. According to Polydeuces, they lingered between slavery and freedom. Two elements made helots differ from other slaves. They were allowed to form their own families. Because helots were deemed public, they mostly worked to cultivate the... While they gave the fruits of their labor to Sparta, this practice... Alternatively, the founding of Sparta is dated around the 9th century BCE. Historical information about the city is limited, but it was known to extend into the region of Laconia. Over time, Sparta started encroaching on the territory of Messenia. Eventually, Sparta gained... The aftermath of the Second Messenian War from 604... The Helots of Laconia mostly respected Sparta's... However,
friend! We're standing in the main section of Olympia, where the Olympic Games themselves took place. Over the course of the festival, athletes competed against each other for prestige and glory to honor themselves and their cities. Enjoy your visit, friend. I'll check in when you're done to make sure you've been paying attention.
The first day of the Olympic Festival began with a swearing-in ceremony for the participating athletes, trainers, and judges. The ceremony took place in front of the altar of Zeus Horkios, or Zeus of the Oath. Athletes would swear that they would follow the Olympic rules, while judges promised to be fair and unbiased. Then the competitions began, starting with a contest between heralds and trumpeters over who would have the privilege of announcing the games. The first day's athletic competitions consisted of wrestling, running, and boxing events for the youngest athletes, aged 12 to 18. The second day began with a grand procession into the Hippodrome to celebrate the start of the popular equestrian events. The most anticipated and spectacular of these was the Quadriga, a four-horse chariot race. Horse racing events were unique in that the winner was not the most skilled jockey, but the owner of the fastest horse or chariot. The Spartan princess Caniska once took advantage of this loophole to skirt the rule that women weren't allowed to compete and earned 2 Olympic victories in the process. The rule also allowed for occasionally strange results, like in 416 BCE, when the statesman Alcibiades entered 7 chariots into a race and won first, second, and fourth place. After the equestrian competitions, the 40,000 spectators migrated to the stadium to watch the pentathlon events. When the day's events were over, funeral rites were performed for the hero Pelops, the mythical founder of the Olympic Games. The night ended with a celebratory feast and a great parade in honor of the day's victors. Victory at the Olympic Games was one of the highest honors a mortal could achieve, and there were several ways to immortalize that honor. Some athletes had statues erected of themselves, while others commissioned poets to write them victory odes. Oral tradition was very important to the Greeks. These odes, called eponychia, were often composed by the finest poets in the land, such as Pindar, Simonides, and Bacchylides. They were usually played at banquets and celebrations attended by the triumphant athlete. The pentathlon took place at the stadium on the second day. As its name implies, it was made up of 5 events: discus throwing, javelin throwing, jumping, racing, and wrestling. There are several differences between the ancient version of events and their contemporary counterparts. For example, ancient long jumpers held weights in their hands to give them momentum to launch, since there was no run-up before the jump. Similarly, if an athlete won the first 3 events, they were immediately declared the winner, instead of being judged by their overall performance in all 5 events. Running events work the same as they do today, with the notable exception of all the athletes being nude. As for wrestling, competitors were not divided by weight class as they are today, but instead by age. The winner was the first to throw his opponent to the ground 3 times. Day 3 started with the most important event of the festival. A procession of Hellenodikai, ambassadors, competitors, and animals made their way to the great altar in front of the Temple of Zeus. The animals were then offered as the official sacrifice of the festival. The afternoon of Day 3 was dedicated to foot racing events. Running was the oldest event of the Games, and in fact was the only event at the first Olympics. The main race was called the Stadion, which was a sprint of around 180 meters. The winner was granted the honor of lending his name to the 4-year period between the Games. This period was known as the Olympiad. The 4 years that followed the first Games in 776 BCE were known as the Olympiad of Coroebus of Elis, the first Olympic champion. Once all the competitions were over, a public banquet was held in the Prytaneon to celebrate the day's victors.
Ούτως υπήν πανάκριβον συντηρήν χείρον. Άλλος εις αλέκτορο οτοκίσετε.
Day 3 start.
Βαβέ, τούτους τους όνους μαστιγού, ακαταπαύστος μαστιγού.
Τηράτε την τάξη, ότε είναι εν στρατεία εξεγύμναζον τους αρίστους, απαιτώ γουν σέβας οίκιστον.
Ήτεν μουσική, εν ρυθμότινη, άδετε και εργάζεστε. Κουκούν, γρηγορείτε παιδες. Μάλλον το έμαθω λέγω.
Ήλιος ημί, η λύηση η ποιμιότερη ανά την Ιφίλιον, αληθώς γεεστέ ο άντρες, η κράτιστη και κάλιστη όντινον εόρακα.
Μένω στα μάλαη, ακαταπαύστος έστι ανίκανον η διαπρογυμνασία.
Σύ, σύρου βασανιώσε, διατάξω τους αλήτας δώσιν σι εν ισχυρόν κλίγμα. Τιμωρήσω άπαντας, ουδεμίαν αμυθία, ουδεμίαν. Τηράτε τούτο καθαρό. 10 μήνας υπό της αυτής στέγης και ομόσαστε αν ουδεπόποτε ακούεστε την εμήν φωνήν. Τηράτε τούτο καθαρό.
Ουε, μη ποιήσεις μη εκτός ομιλήν. Ήτεν μουσική, εν ρυθμότινη, άδετε και εργάζεστε. Άδετε και εργάζεστε. Γρηγορείτε παιδες, γρηγορείτε παιδες. Άλλος της αλέκτορο το κίσετε. Άλλος της αλέκτορο το 10 μήνας από της αυτής στέγης και ομόσατε με το κόμμα καμπούες. Καταπάσκος μαστιγού. Κυράτε αυτό καθαρό. Γεύον.
Παπέ, το εμόν κυρίδιον εξέπνευσε. Εκκλινάνω στα μάλαη.
Μάλλον το αίμα αυτό λέγω χθες. Μάλλον αυτό θείστημη λέγονε με αυτό.
Day 4 was mainly for combat events. Wrestling matches were held in the morning, followed by boxing and pankration. Pankration was a no-holds-barred mix between wrestling and boxing. Almost all moves were permitted, except for biting, poking the eyes or mouth, and striking the genitals. The event was very popular, and it was seen as the ultimate expression of strength and technique. Later on in the afternoon, there was a unique racing event called the Hoplitodromos, or Race in Armor. In this event, competitors wore a helmet and held a shield to simulate running in the battlefield. The Hellenodikai, or judges of the Greeks, were both the game's adjudicators and their organizers. They hailed from Elis, the city in charge of the sanctuary of Olympia, and new judges were elected each Olympiad. They had several responsibilities. Before the games started, they decided which athletes would be allowed to compete and supervise their training. They also drew lots to make the competition brackets. During the games themselves, they picked the winners and kept an eye out for foul play. For the latter, they were assisted by stick and whip-wielding umpires who stood near the athletes and punished them if they were caught cheating. Victory in Olympia was one of the most prestigious honors in all of Greece. Not only would victors be showered in glory in their home city, but their names would be known across Greece. The temptation to glory led some athletes to break their oath to Zeus and cheat. This could be dangerous, as there were many possible punishments should cheaters be caught. They could be disqualified and fined, or if they were caught cheating during a match, they would be beaten by nearby umpires. The most powerful deterrent of cheating, however, was shame. At the foot of Mount Kronios, and on the way to the stadium, were a group of bronze statues called Zanes, the plural of Zeus. These statues were inscribed with the names of the cheating athletes, how they cheated, and the fine that was imposed. The Zanes, which were funded by cheaters' fines, were strategically placed to be highly visible. Individuals or even entire cities could be found guilty of cheating. Victory in Olympia. The Prytaneion was the administrative center of the cult of Olympia and the Olympic Games. The building housed the sanctuary's priests as well as the game's officials. It was also used to stage the grand banquet held on the evening of the third day to honor victors. It also had a sacred function. Its central chamber was the location of the Fire of Hestia, a sacred flame that burned day and night. This fire was used to light the other altars around the sanctuary. This practice may have partially inspired the modern tradition of carrying the Olympic torch.
Χαρακτήρες εν τες τραγωδίες προαιρούνται του ύψους της διανοίας ένεκεν. Τραγωδία εκλαμβάνει τας ιστορίας αυτών και χρήζεται τα
Μεγαλώνει με και πολιώνει με.
Μεγαλώνει με
Θονία
θεά,
και θηροκτών.
αγλαώτη με, τεχνών μη
Φυλαγρώτη
και
και
πολίων με.
Καταδικαστέ ημίνε υπόκειται αξία λέγω εμαθιό.
Hello again! I hope with their respect now is the... Very well.
Του ατόπου υποθάλποντι λέει.
My friend, yes. Your nostrils, I'll check in on...
Perfume-making techniques were invented and perfected in Mesopotamia and Egypt, beginning in the 4th millennium BCE. By the time of the Mycenaean era, perfume played an important role, mostly reserved for kings, priests, and aristocrats in the beginning. It later became more widely available during the classical and Hellenistic periods. Greeks used perfume for more than just personal cosmetics. It also had sacred uses. For example, cults would sometimes anoint their god's statue with perfume, and it was also used during rituals like weddings and funerals. Food and wine could also be scented with perfume to add to a meal's presentation. The art of making perfume was part of medicine and pharmacology, and physicians devoted entire books listing the best perfume recipes. Perfume is made up of two main components: a greasy substance, called an excipient, like vegetable oil or animal fat, and an odorous substance, such as flowers and plants. For ancient Greeks, the most common excipient was olive oil. According to Theophrastus, however, the most valuable oils were those extracted from nuts in the Syrian and Egyptian deserts. The odorous ingredient could be taken from a variety of sources. These include flowers like roses or lilies, herbs like oregano, spices like saffron, resins like amber, and leaves from plants. Some fragrances were also imported from outside of Greece, like Indian cinnamon and Syrian frankincense. These exotic scents were considered
Welcome to Gnossos, traveler, where the Minotaur once prowled.
Knossos was the seat of the old Minoan civilization, where King Minos once supposedly ruled. These ruins have been the backdrop for many important events in both history and... Look for me when...
The island of Crete was first settled around 8000 BCE. Over time, significant towns and maritime trade began to develop. Palaces were built, destroyed, and then rebuilt, culminating in what archaeologists call the Neopalatial period, which began around 1700 BCE. This period lasted for over 300 years and is considered the golden age of Minoan civilization. The largest palace of this period was located in Knossos and featured maze-like complexes of workshops, temples, courts, throne rooms, and living areas, as well as paved roads and advanced plumbing and draining. Trade and external relations were important to the Minoans, and their networks extended across the eastern Mediterranean. As a result, the people of Crete and the lands they traded with often influenced each other and exchanged ideas, usually through peaceful interactions instead of military conflict. The settlement of Knossos was established as early as the 7th millennium BCE. Today, one of the site's most notable landmarks is the palace ruins, located on the Kafala Hill. The ruins are split into two phases: the old palace, which has been poorly preserved, and the new palace. The new palace of Knossos had a surface area of approximately 13,000 square meters, making it the largest Minoan palace. Its focal point was a central court, which was probably used for ceremonial activities. The Minoan palace centers collapsed when Crete was overrun and conquered by a Mycenaean invasion from mainland Greece. However, the date of the final destruction of Knossos' palace is still unknown. During the new palace phase, the ground floor was dedicated to economic activities and contained large storage rooms. The residential quarters, which notably had toilets, were located southeast of the central court, at the foot of the grand staircase. The palace was lavishly decorated with wall paintings depicting things like bull-related sports and richly dressed women. Large stone horns of consecration, which were important Minoan religious symbols, hung prominently in the west court. Other notable parts of the palace include the theatrical area, which is believed to have served as a viewing space, the tripartite shrine, which was dedicated to the worship of an important Minoan deity historians refer to as the Mother Goddess, and the Piano Nobile, a grand space located on the palace's second floor. During his trips to Crete, archaeologist Arthur John Evans discovered several ancient tablets. They eventually led him to define the forms of Minoan writing known as Linear A and Linear B. The Minoans used these forms of writing for recording many things, including business transactions. For example, one clay tablet discovered at the Palace of Knossos was inscribed in Linear B script. The tablet detailed the transfer of coriander, often used in the perfume industry, between a man named Kyprios and another person named Twinon. The deciphering of tablets such as these has given historians great insight into many aspects of Minoan culture and society. According to myth, the half-man, half-bull Minotaur was born after Queen Pasiphae slept with a bull sent by the gods as punishment upon her. This embarrassed King Minos, but he could not bring himself to kill the Minotaur. Instead, he hid the monster in a labyrinth constructed by Daedalus. Daedalus was an important figure in Greek mythology, an ingenious inventor. He once became so jealous of his similarly clever nephew that he threw him from the top of the Athenian Acropolis. As a consequence, Daedalus was banished from Athens, though this did not prevent him from being able to get work. In Crete, he was hired by Queen Pasiphae to construct an artificial cowsuit that would allow her to seduce a bull she was particularly taken with due to a curse from the gods. Daedalus complied, and his invention helped facilitate the birth of the Minotaur. Afterwards, Minos conscripted Daedalus to build the labyrinth, presumably as penance for his role in creating the Minotaur. But perhaps the most well-known story about Daedalus involves his son, Icaros, who used wings built by his father and flew too close to the sun, thus plummeting into the sea. Sometime after the birth of the Minotaur, King Minos' son Androgeos was killed in Athens by the same bull that impregnated his mother. An infuriated Minos demanded that Athens send 7 of their noblest men and 7 of their most virtuous women to Knossos every year. After being carried to Crete aboard a ship with black sails, the men and women would then be cast into the labyrinth to be eaten by the Minotaur. One of the Athenian youths chosen to be imprisoned in the labyrinth, Theseus, had enough of the morbid ritual. Before leaving Athens, he proclaimed he would kill the Minotaur, then return to his city on a ship flying white sails. Before entering the labyrinth, Theseus met King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, who fell madly in love with him. Ariadne provided Theseus with a thread he could unravel to help him find his way back out of the maze. Armed with this thread, Theseus entered the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, escaped the maze, and set sail for Athens with Ariadne by his side.
I see the Minoans played a large part in now. What? Farewell, travel.
Welcome to the gymnasium. The most prominent educators were philosophers, whose teachings reign once your tour is complete.
Philosophy comes from the Greek word philosophia, or love of wisdom. This concept was in direct contrast with philochromatia, love of money, and philotimia, love of honor. As of the second half of the 5th century BCE, Athens was known as Greece's capital of philosophy. Due to the rise of democracy, there was an increasing need for education beyond the basic subjects of elementary school. Athenian citizens needed to be able to participate in various functions of the democratic state, such as being elected for office, proposing new laws, engaging in military decisions, or simply defending their rights. Originally, Athens had no official school buildings for higher education. Sophists and philosophers taught either in private homes or in public spaces like the theater. To recruit young pupils for long-term curricula, they also held classes in gymnasia, where young Athenians underwent physical training. The Cynosarges was a sanctuary to Heracles, located in the south suburb of Athens. At the beginning of the 4th century BCE, Antisthenes used this sanctuary as a teaching spot for his school of philosophy, the aptly named Cynicism. Any free citizen was allowed to involve themselves in the Athenian democratic process. However, to truly influence the flow of politics, their speech, as a result, these were meant to help students achieve arete. But this specific concept of excellence was off. For example, Plato, Socrates, and Isocrates preferred a more moral approach and argued that rhetoric should be used as a means to serve the greater good. Socrates and Plato went even further, declaring that philosophy and wisdom were not only useful tools, but also ethical virtues.
Άγε και φέρε πλειάδα χορευτών και παράστηθη εν ημίν μετασμάτων. Καλώναν ή ορχιστρικών μικρών, συνοδείας χάριν.
Μόνον όταν το επιχείρημα δομείται πιστικών, τότε δίνεται αν κερδάν εν ζήτημα. Ανατρέχομεν εις τραγικούς της δομής ταύτης ένεγεν, μάλλον η Σοφοκλέα.
Ρώμεθα το παραδείγμα των έργων αυτού, ή να αντιβάλλουμε το δέον γενέστε εις την ασυλλογισμός. Άλλο της θέμενος ναός, μεστή πανίγια. Ή να σταθεί εν επιχείρημα δύο οι όροι.
Ancient Greek philosophy was multidisciplinary in nature. In addition to wisdom and logic, philosophers also studied and taught math, geometry, music theory, and even medicine. For example, the philosopher Prodicus wrote a treatise called On Human Nature, where he outlined various explanations on human physiology. Philosophy's influence was also great enough to affect medicine. Hippocratic physicians were known to incorporate philosophical ideas into their work, and the treatise On Airs seems to be influenced by pre-Socratic theories on air being the first principle of the universe. The famed philosopher Socrates had an ambiguous relationship with sophists. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates is portrayed as being in constant opposition with the famous sophists of his time. Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds, meanwhile, depicts Socrates was in fact very poor. He also differed from the sophists in that while they only taught aristocratic youths, Socrates, unfortunately, his controversial ideas and practices did not sit well with the city of Athens, and he was eventually tried for impiety.
Κατενεχείρασα τη των περιδερέων της θυγατρός μου, ψε, ώστε νηνή ημί χρηματίας. Κύβευσε 10 δραχμάσμι. Σύ επιλέγεις τον γη. Επιπιστεύσωσι. Η τραγωδία κινείται μεταξύ κρυών.
Philosophy was not only a collection of ideas, but a way of life. According to philosopher Pierre Hadot, his ancient counterparts had a daily regime of spiritual exercises to combat their passions, doubts, and illusory beliefs. These exercises included meditation on death, contemplation of nature, or speaking with a friend or mentor. Philosophers also followed specific dress codes and diets. They were also part of a community. Plato founded such a school in the early 4th century BCE, when he purchased a property in a grove. The school was designed to groom students into philosopher citizens who could eventually. It followed its own rules and was open to both men.
Ιωνίη την Ιθαμά επανέρχονται
I can tell. Don't. Is there anything? As you wish.
Οστρακών και Ορφέων.
Welcome. The Pnyx was the meeting place of the Athenian Assembly and the physical embodiment of democracy at work. This tour will give you insight into how we can talk more when you have...
The Athenian Assembly was known as the Ecclesia. It met at the Pnyx 40 times a year to discuss various civic matters, and each session usually lasted a few hours. The word Pnyx is believed to mean something close to packed together. This was probably a reference to the fact that during meetings of the Ecclesia, the location would be filled to its all male citizens were allowed to directly participate in the democratic process. Those over 20 years old had the right to speak and vote, while those over 30 could be elected to the higher position of magistrate. In total, there were approximately 30,000 citizens in Athens in the classical... Citizens came from all over Attica's 10 districts to attend the meetings of the Ecclesia. The meeting was presided over by an executive council called the Prytanes. Every session began with a sacrifice to Zeus Agireos, the patron of the assembly. During the meeting, citizens delivered speeches from the Pnyx's platform. Afterwards, the issue was voted on with a show of hands from the gathered assembly. The Ecclesia made important decisions about subjects like grain importation, expenses, and declarations of war. While they could not directly enact laws, they had a say in appointing Athens' legislators, which gave them a large role in shaping the city's daily operations.
Παύσον πάρα αυτά.
While some citizens only participated in the sessions of the Ecclesia, others could become more involved in democracy as magistrates. Magistrates were elected from among Athenian citizens over 30. They were often successful orators and charismatic politicians, and they held much more sway over important decisions than the average citizen. One of the most famous magistrates was Pericles, who was so popular he held his position for 15 years. In theory, Every Athenian citizen over the age of 20 had the right to participate in the assembly. However, some of them lived far from the city, and others could not financially afford to miss a day of work to attend meetings. For these reasons, the city introduced a special allowance called a misthos ecclesiasticos in the 4th century BCE, meant to encourage participation. Originally, it was 2 obols, but the politician Cleon raised it to 3. Athens introduced several innovations that heavily influenced modern society, including theater, architecture, and philosophy. However, their greatest contribution was their democratic government, which introduced the concept of a city ruled by its citizens. The decision to adopt democracy as a government, a choice made in 508 BCE, shaped civilization as we know it, and continues to...
Hello again, wanderer. I trust. Is there anything? Very well. Farewell.
Λέγει ούτως ότι η συμμορία την περιοχή λιμένεται, η φαρπάζουσα ύφους τη βοηθείας και βοφύλακος εξάστεως.